Okay, we're all good. Good evening, members and officers. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Panel on the 17th of February 2022. Thank you all for coming. If the fire alarm procedures are activated, please vacate the offices down the main staircase opposite the lifts in the foyer and assemble on Hawley Square on the green, and officers will assist us back into the building when it's deemed safe for us to return. Would everyone present please ensure their mobile phones are turned to silent and they're not used to make or receive phone calls whilst this meeting is in progress. I'm always tempted there to say text messages, WhatsApps, LinkedIn's and all the rest of it as well, because they still go off. But if we can make sure the phones are on flight mode or something, or switched off. This meeting is being live streamed for members of the public, and it will also be recorded and will subsequently be broadcast on the internet. I can't see any members of the public with us this evening, but does anybody else here intend to film the proceedings? Okay, we will rely on the main filming, and there's no need for me to ask the same question of the public. Speaking under Rule 20.1, do any members have any speeches they'd like to make under 20.1? Okay, and I haven't received any requests for public speaking either. So, moving on to the main substance of our agenda then, apologies for absence. I've had apologies from Councillor Keith Coleman-Cook. Forgive me, with these glasses I can see that, but not you. I've got coloured blobs. Is there anybody missing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I don't think there are. So it's just Keith. So we make a note of that. Are there any declarations of interest on our agenda items this evening, members? Then we move on to the minutes of the Overview and Scrutiny Panel meeting held on the 18th of January. Members, can I have a proposer to propose these minutes, please? Thank you, Councillor Moore. And a seconder, please. Thank you, Councillor Austin. And do members agree? Thank you very much. We now come to the first of our two presentations this evening. I'd like to invite Councillor Jill Bayford to introduce the item for us, and I believe she's going to be handing over to Richard. Jill.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I have an easy ride tonight, I think. I'd like to introduce Richard Hopkins, who is our private sector housing manager, and has for you tonight a detailed and I think very interesting presentation about private housing in the district and how the council regulates private housing in Thanet. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. I'll stand up so I can see everybody. Hope that don't mind. Can everybody hear me?
Do you want to put your mic?
Shall I put the mic? Yeah. Okay. I usually got a fairly loud voice, but right. Yes. So I've been asked to give an overview of private sector housing in Thanet and how we regulate it. So what I've done is done a presentation where I've gone through the team, it's set up, what we do and how we go about stuff and the main gist of what we do. And there's some facts and figures in there as well that hopefully gives you an idea of where we're at. So I thought I'd start with some stats on the private sector in Thanet, just to give you some context. So according to the English House Survey, in England there's about 19% privately rented in most as an average across the country. It's been about 19% for quite a few years now, about 4 or 5 years. And so I've broken it down by ward. Unfortunately, the data is a little bit old. It's the census data, because that's the most reliable data. And we are looking forward to some data coming out in April, May this year, which will update this for last year's census. But you can see that Cliftonville West has 56% privately rented, which is quite significantly higher than 19%. We've got 51 at Margate Central, Central Harbour's 40, and East Cliff is 39. And I think we go down to about Viking, which is just over a third of the way down, is where we get to the average 19%. So we have two areas, mainly Margate Central area of the town and Ramsgate Town Centre. There where they're particularly high compared to the national average. So we have a duty to review our stock and do some general review analysis. So we do that every sort of 5-6 years, something like that. 2002, 2008, we surveyed 100 properties and then extrapolated the data. And then more recently, all local authorities are going to modelling based on information that local authorities and other organisations have. And you can see that in 2002, we had about 9,800 and something privately rented properties, and the estimate in 2017 is now at 17,000. So it has gone up a lot, and that reflects where we are across the country, where from about 2000 to about now, the private rented sector has doubled in size. So private sector housing, that sits within the Housing and Planning Directorate service. So I sit alongside housing options, housing strategy and projects, tenant and leasehold services, council property, and also with our colleagues in planning. And so my team is divided currently into 4 areas. We have a housing improvement team, housing licensing team, empty homes team, and a slightly different coloured cold homes team, because that's a short-term project, which I'll briefly talk about. So the housing improvement team is a statutory function. We have a duty as a local housing authority to respond to complaints of housing disrepair across our district. So if someone has got a problem, their landlord's not fixing their boiler, or there's damp or mould or something like that, we have to respond. And that is something that the housing improvement team does for us. We've got a housing licensing team, also a statutory function, because we have the licensing of houses in multiple occupation, like your bedsits and shared houses and the like. And we have to license all of those if they are 5 or more people and they're sharing. So, and of course, selective licensing, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail a bit later. The empty property team, also a non-statutory service, but vitally important, because obviously we need to try and avoid empty homes where we can. So the cold homes team is effectively an enhancement of a statutory function that we have, and that's to enforce what is known as the MEES regulation, which is the minimum energy efficiency standard. So new rules have come into place over the last few years where every single rented property must meet a minimum standard according to an energy performance certificate. So the core teams are the improvement licensing and empty homes team. The cold homes team is fully funded by BEIS, which is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I can never remember that. So we received £76,000 for a 7-month project. So that's really good. So that really boosts our enforcement capacity. In general, Thanet has been exceptionally successful in recent years, and has almost been successful in every grant application it's made for additional resources to expand our team. So for example, we have had a rogue landlord team for a number of years, and we were given over £500,000 to fund that from the government. And at that time, we were the first local authority in the whole South East region to be awarded anything from that particular government pot. And obviously they liked what we're doing, because they gave us another £250,000 shortly thereafter. So I've talked about the legal duty. The housing improvement team has 1 senior, 4 officers and an assistant. On average, we have around 900 complaints from members of the public each year to deal with. So over the last 5 years, it's nearly 4,500. How do we deal with that? Well, if it's really urgent, we call it high priority and we get out as soon as possible. We're not a blue light service, of course, because we don't have, we can't do things really immediately. Everything takes a little bit of time, and ultimately it's not our responsibility for most stuff. It's the landlord. Priority, where we always get to you within 10 days, but we try and do it quicker if possible. And then we have where the bulk of the stuff, which is not particularly urgent, but definitely needs looking at, and that depends on service demand. But we have a service standard of within 10 weeks, but we try and keep it no more than a month if we can. So just a couple of pictures to give you a little bit of a scenery as such. So that was someone's ceiling in their living room. That was someone's bedroom, and they were living in that property. Actually, that was quite scary because one of my officers went there, and they were with Matt Allwright from Housing Enforcers and the television crew. They didn't know what to do, so they called me in. Well, it's all well and good when it's normal, but when you've got cameras in your face and you decide on something quite serious, it was a challenge. But yes, that was on telly, that one. That one was a young lad, 18 years old, living in a bedsit. Ceiling collapsed, windows broken, and that was his bed. Broken sockets, kids in that room, you could touch the live terminal, which could kill anyone, to be honest. This one was common parts of an HMO, children living upstairs. Anybody could have fallen off that and gone down and given themselves a right mischief, and something quite serious potentially. So there's lots of disrepair for us to deal with. So I was asked how we regulate. So I've just briefly mentioned that the Housing Health and Safety Rating System is the main government prescribed way of assessing housing conditions. Any dwelling should be safe for visitors or occupiers. It's based on a whole house assessment. There are 29 hazards for us to look at and assess. And you get a score, and then it turns out with a banding, it's a bit more complicated than it needs to be. But essentially, you end up with a Category 1 hazard or a Category 2 hazard. If it's a Category 1, then we have a duty to take action, one of the prescribed forms. If it's a Category 2, then we have a power, which is more discretionary. So the HHSFS is a way of assessing property, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what you should do at the end of it. It just assesses the seriousness of the issue. I won't dwell on this too long, but there are the 29 hazards. I would say the most common is excess cold, some of the falling hazards, electrical hazards, fire safety, entry by intruders. Structural collapse and fall elements is quite a common one as well. No hot water or heating is a common thing that comes under excess cold, and personal hygiene for not having hot water for baths and showers and things like that. So, how do we enforce all this? Well, it's obviously best if a landlord can just get on and do it. We could phone them up and they get on and do it. That is the ideal situation. Sometimes it happens, quite often it doesn't, but it is the quickest way of achieving a good outcome. If we're in a situation where we've got to take action, the most common types of enforcement action are improvement notice, hazard awareness notice, prohibition order, emergency prohibition order, and emergency remedial action, where we can go in and do those works ourselves and recharge the landlord, which we did recently, and it was appealed against, and we won, and we actually won costs, which is unusual on a tribunal. But the most common thing that we do is an improvement notice, because that's what gets property into a better condition than it was before. So I chair the Kent Housing Technical Group, and a colleague of mine who's just become a new manager somewhere else in Kent asked me to do some benchmarking, and asked me to ask all the local authorities in Kent how many improvement notices they serve per financial year. So these were the results. I quite like this slide, to be honest, but I think every district is different. But it did reassure me that my team are doing quite well, I think, in the circumstances. This is a bit of a busy slide. The main reason for putting this on is that we don't just use the Housing Act 2004, which most of this comes under. There's loads of different legislation, and the authority here is very proactive, and if there's a piece of legislation that we can use to make someone's life better, we'll use it. There has been a lot of increased regulation in recent years that we've had to take on, and some of it's quite burdensome. So we have to make sure that all letting agents are signed up with a redress scheme. There's new smoke and carbon monoxide regulations, energy efficiency, which will come on later, and one of the big ones, or big two, is electrical safety regulations, where every rented property now has to have an electrical certificate, a bit like the gas certificate situation, and financial penalties, which come on into a bit. In addition to the housing condition side of things, we also, a few years ago, took over the duty of dealing with unlawful eviction and harassment. It's exceptionally challenging in itself, because most of our work is professional officer goes along, sees a problem, serves notice, goes back, hasn't been done, there's an offence, quite easy. This person said, that person said, it's more like a police investigation. It's quite hard, but we've put a lot of effort into it in the last few years. And I just put up a little case study about someone. Funnily enough, it was one of our projects. We'd written to this landlord, said, you've got a substandard property, the energy efficiency needs to be improved. Please go and improve it. He took the stance of, there was a couple, and the lady was pregnant, and asked him to move out temporarily while he did those repairs. He moved him himself and never let them come back, which, and they were safer surfing for a long time, and obviously not enough just before giving birth, which wasn't an ideal situation. So we prosecuted. It was very close for prison, because they wanted another hearing for sentencing, and he just about got away with it. However, he did have to pay our prosecution costs, and had to do 160 hours in the community unpaid, and we assisted the tenants to get a rent repayment order, which was given in the sum of £6,000. So those tenants got £6,000, the landlord's got to pay that. I'll dwell on a few slides, because one of the big things is usually in the past, if an offence is committed by a landlord, we would prosecute. A couple of years ago, a change in legislation, we have the ability to do financial penalties now. And there are certain offences, such as non-compliance of an improvement, not licensing an HMO, and a few other things, as you can see there, that we could issue a financial penalty for. There's a statutory maximum of £30,000, so it's quite a significant figure. But we can't do both. So once we've decided which route we're going to do, we've got to go with one of them. We can't flop across. We have to go with one. A financial penalty that has to be the same level in terms of the criminal standard of proof. But one of the obviously the differences here, the prosecution fines. I mean, we prosecuted a little while back, got a £20,000 fine, but that was obviously stays with the justice system and goes back to the Treasury somehow. With financial penalties, we get to keep the money, and it's ring-fenced to private sector housing enforcement activities. So it's a sort of government sort of push to push local authorities to have the ability to put more resources in and do more enforcement, make more homes safe. So how do we issue financial penalties? Because we're essentially the court. We're making that decision. Are you guilty or not? And once we have, then we look at what the penalty should be, and we look at culpability, their track record, their portfolio size. So bigger landlords should know better, to be honest, and smaller landlords maybe should know better, but might be less informed. And then with risk of harm, so dependent on how serious the problem was that we're dealing with. So we have a table, it's got 192 figures on it, lots of them, and it goes from £1,000 up to £30,000. Like the court system, we can deal with mitigating and aggravating circumstances. So we do go down to about £500 to up to £30,000, so we sort of maximise it if it's appropriate. And we do offer a bit of a reduction if they pay quickly. So if financial penalties are not paid, this is where it gets more onerous for the council, because before it's up to the court system to get their fines, nothing to do with us. But here we have to do that. A certificate signed by our Chief Finance Officer to say that the penalty hasn't been paid is conclusive evidence of that fact. And there are various things, you know, that normal civil debt type situation, bailiffs, order of sale, attachment to earnings, and the like. So where have we got to? So our policy came into effect in 2019. We've served 52 financial penalties. Well, 52 are subject to a notice of intent, because there's 2 stages to it. We've issued 24 final notices. 5 are subject to appeal at the present time. We've imposed £196,500 worth of penalties. 3 have been withdrawn because a gentleman died in that process, and another limited company was wound up and ceased to exist. We've got 25 pending a decision. We've received only about £20,000 so far, but we are dealing with that with our debt recovery team, and recovery procedures are in play. And just to say that if we're aware of the property, you know, there may be the option to put a charging order on their property to try and secure those debts against them. Licensing team, so second team, we've got, was a lot larger when our selective licensing scheme was going and the designation was in place. But that has shrunk down now, obviously, and now we've got 2.6 officers. So two officers and a part-time officer, and they do HMO licensing, selective licensing. We do a little bit of caravans, which I'll mention a bit later, and we do landlord engagement. So this was introduced in 2006, licensing of HMOs, designed to improve the management standards and conditions in higher risk ones. So if an HMO has 5 or more people, and they're 2 or more households, and there's some sharing or non-self-containment involved, then you have to get a license from the council, and if you don't, it's an offence. Up until 2018, it also had to be 3 stories or above, but now they've included 1 and 2 stories. At the present time, we have about 70 HMOs licensed of that size in Thanet. When the new rules come into place, lots of HMOs decided to drop from 5 or 6 to 4 to avoid the licensing regime. So you'll find there's lots of 4-person HMOs around. License conditions, there are some that are mandatory, some that are discretionary that we can add if we want, and we've added as much as we can reasonably to ensure that an HMO is appropriately managed, and it's things like gas safety, fire safety, all the things you could imagine, waste management, ASB, making sure that the landlord takes responsibility for the behaviour of some of their tenants. Not actually the behaviour, but responsibility of trying to deal with it should it arise. And of course, to prevent overcrowding, we have occupancy restrictions. Selective licensing. So we've had 2 phases of selective licensing, which ran to 2006, phase 1, then we went back to back, and then we had another phase that ended last year. Selective licensing is an extension of licensing in as much as if you designate an area, then anything inside the area, if it's rented, it needs a license from the council. The conditions are not quite as onerous as HMOs, but they're pretty wide-ranging, and you can do quite a lot to make sure that landlords take their responsibilities quite seriously. So you had specific reasons for designating selective licensing. The last designation, we wanted improvement in the social and economic conditions, a reduction in ASB and crime, an improvement in housing conditions, and an improvement in deprivation. So that was the last designation, which sort of ran from Trinity Square through to Warwick Road and bounded by North Down Road. So just to see that in context as the rest of Thanet, it was sort of about half the ward of Cliftonville West and about a quarter or a fifth of Margate Central. So the designation has expired, so we're not actually asking for new applications at the moment, but all existing licenses are still valid until they expire, and they usually have a 5-year license. So, you know, arguably all the landlords that were compliant and applied straight away at the early part of the scheme, they had a 5-year license and they're beginning to expire now. Those who are a bit more reluctant to license and license later in the scheme, they'll have probably have a few more years left of being subject to additional regulation. So we have about 1,400 or so still licensed at the moment. Inspections ongoing, we can take enforcement action if necessary, and we talked about conditions a moment ago. So here's just a few figures I've plucked out. We've over the period we've had 2,800 license applications, and some of those license applications can apply to more than one property if it's a freeholder who owns all the flats in the building. So we had, I think that the highest number that came under one license was 29, but it's quite common to have 4, 5, 6 dwellings under a license. At one stage or another, we had about 1,500 allegations of unlicensed premises operating illegally, and we did those investigations that eventually resulted in about 1,300 applications. We fully inspected over 2,000 properties. We've issued nearly 2,400 license condition breach warnings because we've identified something that's not quite right. And in that time, and in the area, the selective licensing area, we've served 652 enforcement notices on landlords to improve their properties. You know, we've also, apart from our proactive work, we had 2,099 complaints that we resolved. In terms of enforcement, obviously lots of notices, but you know, most of it was complied with eventually. But we did do 48 prosecutions specifically on selective licensing legislation and imposed 20 financial penalties. So what are we doing at the moment? We're currently exploring further opportunities, and at the moment the central focus is on the centre of Ramsgate and the centre of Margate. One of the key ones that we're looking for is deprivation at the moment, most likely. And this is a deprivation mapper, and you can see that bright red is the most deprived areas, and some of the other ones you can see outside the towns quite, they sort of relate quite closely to some council housing estates, and of course they fall outside our remit. So we are looking primarily at the towns. At one stage, and that's improved that out of 32,844 areas defined by the government in terms of deprivation, one being the worst and 32,844 being the best, we had number 4 in Cliftonville, and that's across the entire country. So as you can imagine, you know, we've done a lot of that. That's actually moved up in the last edition of the government's data, which is really good. So we did sort of fall down a number of years, but now things are back on the up. But there's still more work to be done.
Sorry to interrupt you, Richard. Just while you've got the map up, it's easier to refer to
the
map while it's up. Obviously it gives a general picture, but for example, the ward of Northwood, you can split neatly in half between quite comfortably often well-to-do areas and those where you would imagine the deprivation is. But on a map like that, the whole of Northwood goes down as an area within 10% of the most deprived in England.
Actually, I mean, you can't quite see on that because it's obviously quite a zoomed out map, but actually the deprivation is based on what's called lower layer super output areas. and they're very peculiar areas. They apply to an area where about 1,500 people live. So each ward is actually broke up 2, 3, 4 different lower layer super output areas. So you can identify which areas specifically are the most deprived. So in some wards, you will see some lighter colours where the lower layer super output area is a bit different. But yeah, when you zoom in, you can see the specific areas that are more challenging.
If it was a matter of numbers of people within that area.
No, so the way they've done it to make it comparable is created an area that's specifically of the same size across the entire country.
Thank you.
So they do actually change from time to time because those population, new builds, all this sort of thing. Yeah. So we recently took over a little bit of work from Environmental Health. They deal with holiday site caravans. And a few years ago, the government introduced lots more legislation specifically aimed at ones that are occupied on a permanent basis by it's someone's home. So we've got 3 sites in Thanet. There's about 207 units, and site licensing is more about the site. It's not really about what's inside the caravan. It's about the services, the widths of road. Can a fire engine get up there, and are they too close or too close to boundaries and stuff like that. So there's conditions on licensing. So we've recently picked that up and have started looking at those sites. So that's something else that the licensing team does. Landlord engagement, of course, it's not all just about enforcement. We want to educate, encourage and get people to do the right thing. It's really, really important. So we actually created a landlord focus group for Thanet. We have a chair that is actually a landlord or an agent, and there's about 15, 16 members at the moment. They meet 2 or 3 times a year, and we can bounce ideas off them for policy, and they can come to us with emerging issues. We also hold an annual event each year to tell landlords about new things coming up or what's going on, and they usually help. There's usually about 50 to 100 landlords that come along to that, so that's quite good. We also collaborate with Atlas, which is an organisation that works across London and some of the regions, to create a landlord accreditation scheme, and through that there are 632 landlords or agents with property in Thanet that are accredited, and they have to do a training course and sign up to a code of conduct. So the Cold Homes team, which is the temporary one, the one we got some money for, it's paid for entirely by the government department Bays, and it's about ensuring that rented property has a minimum energy efficiency standard of E, and anything that is an F or a G is considered to be a substandard property. So EPCs are required when a property is built, sold or rented, and they last for 10 years. And if it's valid and it's an F or a G, then it shouldn't be let. It doesn't extinguish tenancies that are currently in place, but it certainly stops people renting them. And if we find out, which we do because we have gone through everything, then we will be taking action. So if a landlord has a property with an F or a G rating, there are some statutory exemptions, and if they have to register it on what's called the PRS exemption register, a government website that we have to check and enforce, and the PRS means private rented sector. So if you don't comply with the MEES ban, there are differing financial penalties, again, 2,000, 4,000, 1,000, 2,000, non-compliance with notices, false or misleading information on the register, and the time that you have let the property unlawfully. At the moment, though, the maximum you can be fined for letting a prohibited property is £5,000 per tenancy. So what have we done so far since September, when we started? Well, we had a Cold Homes project funded by another government department a couple of years ago, and that ended up with 299 substandard properties. By the time we started this project with the new funding, that was a year later, so we had done some enforcement during that year as well. We come down to 198, so we found 26 new ones and 100 and something had been improved. So what we've done since then is we've served 173 compliance notices, which relate to 132 homes, because some properties are owned by more than one person. We've received 82 responses. We've improved 48 homes, so people are living in much better property as it stands. We've got 44 reminder letters been sent out. And now we're in the last 6 weeks, and that phase is penalty notices. So penalty notice will start to be issued shortly. And we still have 118 homes that remain substandard, but we will pursue those as best as we can. There are some changes ahead. I just thought I'd add this in because the government are considering increasing the minimum standard to a C, which is quite a significant jump. For new tenancies from 25 and existing tenancies from 2028. There's also an increasing cost cap, because at the moment landlords, if it costs more than £3,500 to improve, they can get an exemption, which, you know, it doesn't appear to be a very high amount of money, and they're actually thinking of changing it to £10,000. They're also thinking of increasing the penalty to £30,000, pretty much like what the financial penalties for the stuff I mentioned earlier. But they haven't responded to the consultation yet, but that is something in the pipeline. And just for completion, for the fourth team, we've got empty homes. I have mentioned this overview and scrutiny not that long ago, so just a couple of slides. Obviously, they're not great. We don't want them. We're desperate for housing, and they can cause real problems in the neighbourhoods. Government use council tax data every October to decide how many empty homes there are. So as of last October, there was 877. And when we talk about long-term empty homes, we talk about ones that have been empty for 6 months or more. We adopted an empty property plan in 2020 to give a flavour of all the things we're doing and we're trying to achieve. We've got a team of 2 officers, an empty homes officer and a support officer. Current caseload, they have 732 properties they're monitoring and trying to do their best to get back into use. Although it should be noted that empty homes, it's not unlawful to own an empty home, so dealing with them is needs to be a bit more creative. Informal advice and encouragement is the key one that we use to get empty homes back into use, but we also collaborate with Kent County Council with interest-free loans, and of course enforcement action where it's appropriate if it's affecting next door or it's a real eyesore or something like that. So we try to tackle all of those on our list, but we do prioritise for more advanced enforcement action where it's possible, and we've got 4 bands. So we've got 48 in our highest, 122 in B, and those are the 2 areas that we focus most of our energies on, but doesn't mean that we don't look at the others and try our best where we can. Kent County Council collects data to say how many empty homes have been brought back into use with the help of some form of council intervention. And of the last, I think it's 13 of the last 16 years, we've achieved the most as a local authority in Kent. And you can see that we're still pretty much there. And for this year, we're at 139 as of December, so we're on target to get to our increased target based on our empty homes plan of 170. And lastly, you'll be pleased to know, is that we work collaboratively with KCC because they have a large recyclable fund of money for empty homes and can be used as interest-free. And because we work very closely with them, you can see over the years since that scheme's been in place that we, as a local authority, have managed to bring back into use 33% of all the homes that have been by that scheme. And so about 14, well, nearly, not quite, but you know, 13.8 million pounds has been loaned, encouraging 14.8 million of other investment, totaling 28 million. And you can see 418 homes have been brought back into use through our collaborations. So that's it. Hopefully that's a bit of a whiz through everything that my teams do, and hopefully that was of some interest. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Right, okay, before for questions, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Richard for that very informative presentation, covering the many aspects of the private housing work that he and his team deal with. And I'd like to thank him also for the excellent work that he and his team do. So thank you very much, Richard. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And Jill, questions, please. Whoa, lots of hands up there. Tisha.
I don't think I was the first to have my hand up. I've got a great long list, so I'll just go for... I'm from Central Harbour, and I've got a colleague here from East Cliff, so obviously we're really interested in the selective licensing. Can you just say a bit more about what the pluses and minuses are, maybe, of a selective licensing scheme from the council's point of view? Yeah,
sure. It depends on your viewpoint. If you're a landlord or a tenant, landlords obviously generally not overly keen because licenses do come with a fee because it's supposed to be self-funding. So they have to pay for a license to be subject to more regulation, which, on the face of it, might not seem great. But what I always say is that, if we're sinking a lot of effort into an area to try and improve it for everyone and the community and everything, inevitably values are going to go up. And you probably have seen the news quite recently about Margate. So obviously selective licensing may only be a small element of that, but certainly we have done a huge amount, as you can see, over the last 10 years to try and improve it. So one assumes that those people that paid £600 a couple of times for a license have probably got greater in terms of capital asset growth. What was really interesting when we did the consult, because you have to consult for each scheme, the first scheme, I think the tenant or resident support was about 60-something% and landlord support was 15%. Second time round, residents went from 60-something% to 80-something%, and landlord support went from about 15 to 26.9%. So you can see we did turn the view of some of those landlords. And so I think more, how can we say, more strategic thinking landlords probably think it may not be a bad thing, although they don't particularly like paying the fee. I think there's always going to be some landlords that are just going to absolutely not be happy with that policy. We were subject to a judicial review on our first one, which we ultimately won. Hopefully that's answered some of that question.
Thank you. That's really good.
Councillor Curry, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Richard, for your presentation, and thanks to your team and all the work you do. My question is I suppose, regarding landlords as well, and it would fall under the remit of the housing improvements team. We've seen a worrying trend where landlords are asked to do work, improvements, and sometimes because maybe they can't afford to or they don't want to, they end up handing out Section 21s to their tenants. And we're getting a lot of casework at the moment from tenants that are being forced out of homes under a Section 21, where the landlord really has decided not to do improvements. I just wondered, is there any way that we can do more to encourage landlords to do this work, to prevent them from handing out Section 21s? Because a lot of these people, as we know, they're paying, as an example, £550 for a two-bedroom. The landlord knows that they can now get 750, 800, and sometimes this is the reason they're doing this. And some of these tenants end up having to move out of the area. I know it's a difficult situation, but just wondered if there was any more that we could do, and maybe your team could do to help this. Thank you.
So there's a couple of things to mention on that point. First, well, in terms of the principle, you're absolutely right. A landlord at the moment can issue a Section 21 notice, a no-fault eviction, and he can do it for any reason and not give a reason. And that is completely lawful at the moment. So yes, we see it on a regular basis that someone makes a complaint. and then subsequently, they're served with a Section 21 notice. There is a small element of law that is helpful, but not that helpful. If the local authority serves an improvement notice, there is a ban on evictions for 6 months. However, before you can serve an improvement notice, you have to notify the landlord that you're going to do an HHSRS inspection, because that's a lawful thing. We can't just go along, inspect it, and then serve a notice, and then bang, they got 6 months protection. We have to notify the landlord, because that is very important, because if you don't, then everything that you do subsequently falls because you haven't done it legally correct. So the landlord has to get notified at an early point, and if he decides he's going to make that decision, and it will always take us a bit of time to get an improvement notice, because they're quite complex pieces of legal paperwork, so it might take a few weeks to get that done. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, in as much as the government have absolutely confirmed that they are pushing on with the ban on Section 21 notices. So, so in the not too distant future, it's almost certain that such eviction processes will not happen. There will be some exemptions, like if you want to sell the property or something like that, but generally speaking, there won't be a ban. We won't be able to just on a whim evict your tenant. So that is certainly something that the government has reinforced recently.
Thank you. Councillor King?
Thank you, and that was a really interesting presentation. I just wondered if you could give a few examples. You said at the beginning of the presentation about the sort of 3 levels of responses, and the complaints rota was the longest time. What sort of things would come under that category?
So perhaps just whiz through them all. It'll probably be helpful. So the top one, the high priority, would normally be things like if there's a electric cable waving around that's live and there's kids in the house, or there's no water, which has happened just recently for another case. So you've got no water, something really dangerous, or it's in danger of structural collapse or anything like that, then we'll get there really quickly. We say 2 days. But usually if we get a high priority, we're there straight away as soon as possible. Priority is for things that we think shouldn't wait too long. And one of the main things that comes under our priority one is no hot water and heating, which is a very common complaint that we have. Boiler's broken and perhaps the landlord's not keen on fixing it. And of course, particularly this time of year, especially if there's vulnerable people in the household, you've got no heating, no hot water, inability to wash. So again, while we say 10 days, we tend to get to them pretty quickly as well. Things that would probably come on to the main bulk of the rota, where people have to wait their turn, because ultimately it's only fair that as people come to us that we see them in turn. Could be things like a little bit of damp and mold here. Maybe there's a bit, in one of the rooms, it's not great, but it's not immediately going to be any serious risk, but something needs to be resolved. And of course, when we get complaints in writing, we're often not quite sure the severity, of the situation. Maybe the windows are not, a bit drafty or rattly, or not quite right, or not quite opening properly. Obviously, if we thought it was an entry by intruder type hazard, then we'd be there quicker. But I would say most of it goes on the rota to make sure we see people as quickly as possible. In the summer, it tends to get to about 2 weeks, maybe a bit less. But we have to factor in the time that we have to give landlord adequate notice of the inspection to give them opportunity to arrange to be there. So so we send out letters and everything. So that, even if you do it the quickest situation, it's probably going to be a week. But in the summer, it's 2 weeks. Like any team at the council, sometimes we have staff shortages, and, and when the winter comes along, the damp and mould suddenly gets a lot worse and complaints start jumping. So it can. We've never breached our service standard of 10 weeks. And I think at the current time it's somewhere, but it's about 5 weeks at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you. You said Cliftonville West was the 4th most deprived nationally, but had got better recently. Where is it now? Do you know offhand?
I think it's 100 and something.
Oh,
if I remember rightly.
That's
yes.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Councillor Hugsey.
Thanks, Chair. Can I ask 2 questions, or has that been greedy? All right. Thanks, Richard, for your presentation. It's really useful, as always. You were saying about your cold homes team. So you've got the funding till March. What happens after that? Is there more funding available from central government? And then, I'll answer that.
Yes, probably best by that time. My memory's terrible. Right? So there's no more money at the moment from central government. However, the main thrust of what we need to do and the work that we need to do to get to where we are has been done, because we managed to get, what we've done is we seconded one of our excellent officers to be a senior, and then we brought in a domestic energy assessor who's properly qualified and can really give advice on how to improve the issues that have been raised. And then we have a fabulous administrative assistant who has just been absolutely brilliant. And between them all, they have managed to crack out all the compliance notices that we could possibly do. There are no more that we could do at this present time. And ultimately, we'll have the penalty notices out shortly. Now, there is a slight issue in the law, and hence the reason for the consultation by the government is that you can only financial penalty them up to the point of £5,000 per tenancy. So once you've reached the £5,000, then our hands are tied. But what we will do is issue a penalty to everyone that fails to comply with the regulations. I mean, if it overruns a bit, we'll manage that. We'll manage that within existing resources. And then, of course, it'll come through the debt recovery procedures if the payment's not forthcoming.
Let's say we talked about selective licensing in Margate and then maybe bring it into Ramsgate, which would be great. So it seems like what's going to happen? What's the long-term plan? Because you're saying the licenses are going to expire in 4 years' time for most of the landlords. So what will happen then? What's the long-term plan? Thanks.
So there is the size of the schemes that we've done before were they're at the maximum before you need Secretary of State approval. So what we're potentially looking at is something that would have to go to government, and government have been, wouldn't be wrong for me to say, have taken quite a long time to assess such applications, but they have started coming through. But before we move to that position, we're in a situation where we now need to do another form of stock modelling, stock condition survey of Thanet, because we think these are the areas, but we really need an independent document to say, well, actually, we need to look at this as well. But I suspect that it will come back to where we think. But so we're currently, and I'm working with digital as well, because we've got a new product from a company that has got algorithms and all sorts of stuff, and they use huge amounts of data and crunch all that and give us a really good report. So we're just working on whether that data could be achieved. Can we actually provide that data? It's all anonymized, so shouldn't be no GDPR issues. So there's a meeting next week between myself and digital to try and push that on. Once we've got that done, and I'm told that could be done within 12 weeks, then we're looking to get a consultant to help us prepare a new proposal, and the consultant that we're looking at the present time is a possibility, is someone that has never failed to achieve a designation for their local authority and have been working with the big authorities in the country. So, but they obviously can't really get going until we have this survey report, which hopefully we can push on. And then after that, then we would have to go to a public consultation, and that's a minimum of 10 weeks. And then we would assess the outcome of that, and then obviously it would be presented to council to determine what we should do. And then if we do decide that the designation is the right thing for us to do, depending on whether it's, Margate and Ramsgate or one or the other, or wherever it may be, then we would go to the Secretary of State, ask for approval, and then once they approve it, it'd be 3 months from there. So realistically, we're probably thinking a couple of years. But what the positive thing in some ways is that the landlords that were more reluctant to license, like I said earlier, they are going to be licensed probably for another 2, 3, 4. So actually, but if something did come in that area, they'd probably be still hanging on to their old licensing. And they would actually passport onto that for the life of that existing license.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Richard and Jill, for your presentation. Playing devil's advocate, all this legislation is for dealing with rogue landlords. There are good landlords out there who have rogue tenants. So what policies and procedures have we got to support them, if any? Thank you.
So the remit within private sector housing is obviously to make sure housing is safe. But no, I understand exactly what you're saying, because we routinely come across challenging situations where the tenant has made life unnecessarily difficult, perhaps. But what we do is obviously take a view on a case-by-case basis of what we should do about it. So, for example, if a tenant has complained to us, we've gone there, we've written a report, we've served a notice or something, and if we genuinely believe that the works haven't been completed due to the obstruction of the tenant, then we wouldn't take any further action for the time being, because we only take action when it's in the public interest to do so.
I'm thinking more along the lines that we can't make people live the way you and I live. But if you've got a tenant that isn't living in a safe manner and has caused the problems to that dwelling, and the landlord has got to keep his property in a good order, is there anything that you can do to support the landlord to deal with those tenants that don't look after their properties? Because otherwise they would be evicted because they're detracting on the value of that commercial interest.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, we work closely with our colleagues in the Margate Task Force. If we see any issues, or where we think other colleagues in other professions or services can help out, then we certainly engage that as much as we possibly can. We don't just go in there and focus with a silo thinking. We try to try to do everything we possibly can, but there are some times when we can only do so much. Because we have a legal remit on where we are, and when it comes to disrepair, if it is very serious, even though it perhaps may be the fault of the tenant, we may be under a duty to take action against the landlord to deal with that, because that is our duty, and quite often we have tenants that have children. It may be the parents are causing some issues, but it's not their children, for example. So we do have to be very careful. But there are certain circumstances where we will not take action because we're satisfied that the tenants have not been there. There is only one small area of legislation specifically relating to HMOs, where if a tenant obstructs the landlord in some things, that we could take action and threaten that. But it's only a very small area that we can tackle. For the most properties, that power is not available.
Did you say your question had already been asked, Councillor Rattigan?
Yes, basically, it's obviously the selective licensing obviously works, and that can be shown by the stats. Why does it come to an end? You know, why doesn't it carry on? I think a lot of it was answered in your sort of previous question.
Yeah, I mean, there are various reasons. I mean, you know, originally selective licensing was introduced as a 5-year plan, and the government's, you know, only allowed it to be for 5 years because the thought process was you could deal with it in 5 years. I think that is incredibly naive. I think if you meet the test for designation and you have an area that has, you know, become, you know, troubled for various reasons, to think you could turn that around in 5 years is naive. So I understand, I believe, because I think we were the first authority in the country to designate when we were given those powers, because in 2006 the powers come out, every designation had to be approved by the government, and in 2010 it was given that local authorities could designate themselves, and we did that. We rushed it, well, not rushed it, but we worked hard, but dedicated officers to get that to a point where we designated that in January 2011. Yeah, so we believe we're the first local authority to back a scheme, have almost identical schemes back to back, such that when day one finished, the next one come along. We were threatened with judicial review on the basis of you've done it once, why do you need it again? But that didn't come to light because I think we had a fairly robust proposal. But where we're at now is that area has improved a lot, but it could still do with some further help and assistance. But there are other areas around that often we've been asked to look at that that potentially could benefit from selective licensing. So I think the general thought processes was we'll take a step back, look at it a bit more holistically, see if we can do something that perhaps affects a wider region or wider areas where we can help more people.
You'll forgive me for drawing this to a close now. I'm sure if you were to email a question to Richard, you would receive an answer fairly quickly. I was also just wondering whether a similar presentation might be given on one of the drop-in evenings where a broader section of councillors will be able to see.
Speak to Bob about
I just wondered whether that might be something we could do as well. But I would like to thank you very, very much. I'm sorry to have brought it to an end, but I'm conscious that we have Adrian Verrill here to present as well. So can I thank you very, very much on behalf of this panel for coming and doing your presentation, and Councillor Jill Bayford, thank you very much for coming as well. And as is customary, we'll give you a moment just to pack up and leave if you'd like to, or you're very welcome to stay and listen to Adrian. But thank you very much, and apologies again, members.
See you later. You've not got plans. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay, members, thank you very much. I'll now call upon Adrian Verrill to introduce his report on the Birchington Neighbourhood Plan. I won't pretend to know what Regulation 16 consultation formal response is, but we're going to find out. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Thank you. Yes, members, I'm just really going to briefly introduce the report.
Regulation 16, I should start with that, I guess, is the kind of final formal consultation before the examination into the neighbourhood plan takes place. So that consultation is running at the moment. It finishes on the 24th of February, next Thursday. Beyond that, this is a slightly strange situation for those of you who've not been involved in neighbourhood plans. Probably most of you, it's prepared by a neighbourhood plan group or a parish council, and at different stages, effectively the district council has to take on responsibility for progressing certain things through to the examination. So we are hosting the consultation at the moment, and after that consultation is finished, we will collate the comments that have been made. The examination is set up, so it's not exactly like a local plan examination because it's an examiner rather than an inspector, but it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. So we're working with Birchington Parish Council at the moment to appoint an examiner to carry that out. This report is just about the comments we are recommending that this council makes to that consultation. I know that sounds like we'll be making comments to ourselves, but actually we're making comments on the neighbourhood plan, which will be given to the examiner. So in the report, we've set out some recommended comments. The summary of that is in paragraph 1.11. I should say that we're actually very supportive of the neighbourhood plan. A lot of work has been done by the parish council and their neighbourhood planning group. They've gathered a lot of evidence. There's a lot of very sound stuff in there. So we're not making a huge amount of comments, as you can see from that paragraph. And those responses are set out in more detail in the table at Annex 1. So we've summarised them here, but there's a bit more detail in the annex. And I won't go through that all in detail, but if members have got any questions, I will happily answer them. The one thing I would point to, policy B4 in the Birchington plan talks about the local list. Now I know probably some of you as councillors will have encountered the local assets list, important local listing as against the national listed buildings process. In the neighbourhood plan, there is a policy which talks about applying certain policies to the local listed properties and assets. At the moment, there is a draft list that the parish council, neighbourhood plan group and others have put together. That has to go through certain stages before it sort of achieves more formal status. We're not suggesting they change that policy, but obviously it won't carry full weight until that list is kind of finally adopted. I'll leave it there. I'm more than happy to ask questions about the suggested responses or about the neighbourhood plan process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, do you have any comments you'd like to make? Councillor Fellows.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just want to reiterate a few comments, especially what's in Annex 1. A huge amount of time has been spent on this neighbourhood plan. Quite a dedicated group of people have put it together. They're volunteers. They've worked for 6 years putting this neighbourhood plan together. And it's a product of consultation, collaboration and research that I've produced a very professional document which I've actually seen and I've been a part of, and because I was a Birchington Parish Councillor myself. So as the group knew I was a member of this Overview and Scrutiny, they've just wanted me to make a few comments to TDC on their behalf, and also answer a few of the queries that are in the Annex 1 concerning policy B4, B8, and so you have to excuse me because I only got this late today, so, and policy B21 as well. So I mean, what they wanted to say was, obviously I just reiterate that the neighbourhood plan is a product of 6 years consultation, collaboration and research, There's been extensive community engagement at each stage of the development, and the plan is a true reflection of the community values and expectations. The TDC officers should be thanked for their patient support and advice, and the fact that there's been minimal comments on the neighbourhood plan from officers at this stage illustrates how beneficial the joint working has been. So I would go back to what you were saying about policy B4. There was a comment that you were saying that about the list hasn't been fully generated. They did say that they didn't think that on that policy that there's been enough support from the TD officers, and they're quite concerned about the lack of progress on that, which obviously going to create less effectiveness of the national plan policies. So they're quite concerned that local list hasn't been generated as yet. So that's all I want to say at the moment. I mean, we can talk about the other policies if anybody's got any concerns about them, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Fellows. And that, I wonder if I can turn to you very quickly on policy B21 there on the annex. The suggestion is delete the words to the parish council.
Yeah, that's right. Because Thanet District Council is the local planning authority, not the parish council. In fact, when you talk about local plan policies, inspectors often remove the words to the district council, because their argument is that the policy is for the decision maker, whoever that happens to be. So that's the reason for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Fellows.
So what they said about policy B21 is that they believe the policy is entirely consistent with the national planning and policy framework and the local plan. It supports the local plan policy to deliver 30% affordable housing and simply seeks to achieve transparency where the local planning authority deems that it's not viable for a developer to deliver that requirement. I think that's been seen recently with other planning applications as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, all I'd say to that, I understand parish council's concern, but ultimately the decision about the level of affordable housing, the viability study, is a matter for this council. Obviously, if the parish council make comments at application stage, the case officer and the planning committee can take those comments into account. But it's not a decision to be made by the parish council. It's a technical thing. Not to say the parish council can't have a view or make their comments known or make their views known, but ultimately the decision is for the district council.
Thank you.
Which is what we are today.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Councillor Boyd, please.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if you could just expand a bit more about, I mean, I'm not an expert on planning and I won't ever pretend to be, but could you expand a bit more about the green wedge policy and whether there might be a slight contradiction with our own policy, and that should be something we should look into, as it could open up the floor for other neighbourhood plans to potentially come up with their own green wedge policies. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, it's understandable that the parish council and others wanting to protect particularly important green spaces. I understand that. And a lot of these areas, if it's outside the urban area, they're protected by general countryside policies anyway, because the way we phrase our policies is that unless it's something that we've allocated in the local plan, it shouldn't come forward unless there's specific justification for it. So whilst I understand that sort of general concern about protecting important areas, the green wedges have a very particular role. There's a green wedge between Birchington and Westgate, for example, and it's about preventing those two settlements coalescing. And there's another one between Broadstairs and Margate and Broadstairs and Ramsgate. And it's really about trying to stop the sort of more urban areas, if you like, coalescing and closing up those gaps. Our view is that that doesn't really apply in this case. It obviously does between Birchington and Westgate on that side, but really to the other side, to the south and beyond, to the west, you're not really talking about closing up gaps between urban areas as such. So, and our concern is that we've been very successful with the green wedge policies in Thanet. We've been able to defend those continuously through several local plan cycles and at appeal generally. And obviously we don't want that policy to become undermined by trying to apply it to areas it doesn't really apply to. So that's the reason for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Adrian. Can I just ask a question about process rather than about this specific plan? So, Thanet District Council has made comments. Birchington Parish Council or the people who've written the neighbourhood plan want to respond to those. Does all of that then go to the examiner as is? They're not going to change that plan now on the basis of what you've said. That the plan is how it is, and then all of that with your comments goes to the examiner and then is considered on that basis. Is that right?
It's a bit like we have a similar stage called Regulation 19, which is basically the same sort of formal consultation. So we publish that, we get loads of comments back. We don't change the plan at that stage. It's for the inspectors to sort of look at the different position, and it's the same here, really.
And then the examiner will the examiner then recommend, will say, yes, what Thanet District Council said on this and this, that needs to happen.
Yeah.
But on this, then we're happy with how it is anyway, or whatever. That's the kind of feedback that the examiner will give.
That's right. The examiner will give recommendations both to us, I think, and to the parish council to say, in my view, the plan shouldn't be amended on this particular case, but should be amended on these. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Check to see if Councillor Piper has a question before.
Before you go home and get beaten up.
I'm going to get thumped, aren't I? Members, any more questions or comments you'd like to make? Looking at the options before us, if I start with number 3 option is the council does not respond to the Regulation 16 consultation. I think we're probably all agreed that that would not be a good idea, which takes us to options 1 and 2, that the comments in Annex 1 of this report are agreed to be submitted as the council's formal response to Regulation 16 consultation, and option 2, that these comments are amended before being submitted to the council's formal response to Regulation 16 consultation. I haven't seen any suggestions or heard any suggestions for amending, so does that leave us with option 1, that the comments in Annex 1 of this report are agreed to be submitted as the council's formal response to the Regulation 16 consultation? If that's the case, can I have a proposer, please? Councillor Tomlinson, thank you very much. And a seconder? Councillor Piper, thank you very much. Do members agree? Agreed. Thank you very much. Moving on then to the next substantive item in our agenda. I'm not going to try and spin that screen anymore. Makes me eyes water. We've got the review of the overview and scrutiny work programme that I think most of us are familiar with. We have the next Cabinet Member presentation is on information, communication and technology. This stems from a request that I asked Charles Hungway to put to Cabinet for us on how we've been responding for the need for improving information and communications and so on. So we look forward to that in March. In April, I've asked if we can have the climate emergency declaration that we made. Can we have an update about how that is going? One particular question I have, but we'll take as many questions as are available at that time if members wish to bring them, is the business of printing. Yes, no doubt the council's printing has gone down significantly, but how many of us are doing a lot of printing at home, which has shifted the footprint from this building and scattered it around Thanet? But that's just one area, but that was an area I thought we might like an update on to see how that's going. In July, which is the next available meeting for a presentation, I've asked the leader to come and talk to us about the effectiveness, or not, of the Cabinet Advisory Group system that's been developed, to see whether they are well attended and whether they are actually helping the leader in the way she puts together concerns of members and members of the public, and the way in which the council is operating. So those three are due between now and July. Can I encourage you, please, if you've got any other particular areas you'd like a presentation on, please either contact me if you wish, or Charles, and copy me in so I know what's being asked. But does anybody have anything this evening that they would like me to put onto this list to communicate to Charles? Would you like to sort of take it back and have a wee think? But we've got some interesting subjects coming up, and as we've seen this evening, they can be very, very informative. I have had a request from a member of Ramsgate Town Council that we set up a subcommittee or a working party to monitor progress on the future High Street scheme at Ramsgate, the Heritage High Street scheme at Ramsgate, and the Welcome Back Fund. Because the request came to me that would the committee set up something to look at these things, what I propose to do, and I hope you won't mind, is I'm going to point that councillor towards the link which will show the videos we were due to be shown the other day, but we're not able to see, but they are available to have a look at. And then perhaps when that councillor has had an opportunity to see those and see what's happening with this funding and so on, we can then revisit the subject. So I haven't forgotten about the request, notably if there were to have a review on that kind of activity, the earliest opportunity would be August. And we will find out whether or not it's a suitable subject for a working group, or whether it's more keeping people updated with progress that's being made. But since I received the email, I thought I should bring it to you. There has been a request. Councillor Tomlinson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that. It'd be wrong for me and remiss to say I'd like to think, because a lot of us over here are also being asked the same, where is this money going? Obviously it's in our online newspaper and everything else and answered by so many people. But I think what you've come out with here for Ramsgate, I don't think Margate should be left off. But you know, if that's
there's lots of information on websites around these funding activities, but Sorry, just to say, there is a lot of information out there already on these funding schemes via our websites. However, we don't have a problem as officers coming along in a sensible time period, giving you an update against the fund that's been allocated, the funds that have been allocated, and how they've been spent and what they've been spent against. Got no problem doing that. I think it's better as a presentation like that rather than a working group. But you know, that's for you to decide. But no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Councillor Fellows, did you want to give us any update on the work of the Coastal Waste Review Working Party thus far?
I'd love to, Chair. it's such an interesting subject. Yeah, so I have here, hot off the press, an initial draft. It's very drafty. It's an initial draft. We're going to call a meeting within the next couple of weeks where we all sit around, the working group sits around, myself, Councillor Austin, Councillor Keane, Councillor Rattigan, Councillor Tomlinson, where we will add or take out whatever it is. It's quite a lot in there. And we'll present it at the next overview and scrutiny, which I think is the 15th of March. And if it's okay then it'll be presented to Cabinet in April. Hopefully then all the recommendations will take on board, but we'll see.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the work that you're doing on that behind the scenes. I'm sure we'll be Very pleased to see it when it comes out, hopefully in March.
It's been very interesting to be part of, and can we say a particular thank you to Charles for all his support for the work he's been really, really helpful.
The forward plan and exempt cabinet report list. Do any members have any comments they wish to make on that list? Okay, thank you. In that case, that concludes the business for the meeting this evening. It's 8:25. The live streaming of this meeting will now end. Thank you all for your attendance and participation in what we do, and thank you to all the officers for coming and supporting us in the way that you do.